two different things. Thanks. Yeah, that's all the time. A little bit. Makes it way easier. And participate.
Yes.
Positive.
It's very. Yep. Exactly.
LBE. I'm doing. Morning. Good morning. How you doing, Nate? Good.
Good morning. I am Ed Hammer, Assistant Attorney General, and I represent the state of Hawaii. This morning, the board authorized an executive session to discuss the matter that has been noticed for executive session, specifically the replacement property acquisition, Bear Creek Financial County. The discussion was limited to that information that might give competitive bargaining advantage to a person whose interest may be adverse to the trust interest. It is authorized under Colorado Revised Statute Section 246402(3)(a)(1). No decisions were reached in executive session, and now the board is back on the record and ready to proceed with the rest of its agenda. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you, Ed. And you know, I'm noticing Bill and I are not on the screen. I might move down by. I'm a disembodied voice. Can we
Shift.
just a wee bit?
Want me to move on one or?
You are probably fine. I just. There's a voice somewhere.
Thank you for noticing that, Christine. I was wondering why you guys were being extra socially distanced this morning.
Bill and I just wanted to stay on screen.
Good.
Okay, good.
Sorry.
We can make room for folks to have seats too.
Come on.
You just work your way in here. I think we've got a few over here. All right. I think we are reassembled. With that, good morning. We had a brief executive session prior to our gathering now. We are the State Board of Land Commissioners. For those of you who missed the previous introduction, all 5 commissioners are present with us here in beautiful El Paso County, where yesterday we spent a terrific day, kind of all over, touring various properties that we have here in the county, and certainly those related to our discussion today. So appreciate the hospitality and everyone who joined us as we spent some time together. We have a new commissioner, Commissioner Crowe, joining us for her first meeting, and really it was terrific to have you yesterday with us as well. Your knowledge is deep in understanding the issues that we're going to be discussing, but I thought you could just take a couple of minutes and introduce yourself, your background a bit. That would be great.
Thank you, Commissioner Cameron. Hello, everyone. As mentioned, Deborah Crowe. I currently work for the Nature Conservancy, which is a global conservation organization, which fits well with the natural resource seat that I'm occupying. In that regard, over the last 10 years, I have had experience globally and also in North America, particularly in the US, around agriculture, conservation, and impact investments. Prior to the Nature Conservancy, I had a 20-year career in investments, commercial investments, finance, specifically oriented around real estate. I live in Denver and Green County. I've had prior experience with the State Land Board and hold it with the staff and the commissioners in high regard. So this is a real honor for me to join State Land Board as commissioner.
Well, we're honored to have you, grateful. So thank you. With that, we'll start working through our agenda. This is a moment for open public comment for anything that's not on today's agenda. If there's any online, I did not see any come through on email unless something came late and I missed it. Okay, no.
Nothing came in late.
Nick, is there anyone online?
Members of the public, if you'd like to address the board, you can use the raise hand feature on your viewer to alert our attention. And a reminder, this is for those items that are not on today's agenda. I don't have any hands, Commissioner.
Okay, with that, we'll just keep moving forward. Director Ryan, any announcements for us?
My big announcement, we have already taken care of, is Commissioner Fro joined the board, so welcome.
All right,
I have one. Actually, Justin, Barry, can you turn your camera on? After like a 2.5-year effort and a long search, we were, I think, really fortunate to find somebody to join us as our water program manager. His name is Justin Bury. He's on the call today and will be joining us Monday. Monday's actually his first day. Justin comes from DWR in Division 1. And we had invited him to listen in today. So I was thinking I first introduced him to you all when we were in person next, but that's going to be a long time. I think that's not till November. So anyway,
Justin, if you'll say something, we'll actually get to feature you here in the room.
Hi, thanks for having me. Sorry, my camera's not working for some reason, but appreciate the introduction, and I'm excited to join the land board. Thank you, or the staff, I should say, not the board.
Thank you, Justin. We're glad you're on board with us. And now we all get to guess what you might look like. Now we have done it. All right, anything else? Yesterday, we had the good fortune of having Vanessa Mazel with us on our tour. And you've now become a regular of the land board, and so I think you're part of the family. So welcome, and thanks again for spending the time with us yesterday and here to offer the DNR report.
Anywhere you want to be.
Anywhere? Okay,
Yep.
super. I want to be right here. Sorry, carry on.
For our audience, Vanessa works for the Department of Natural Resources, which we are a part of, and she's going to update us on a few of the other issues that are relevant to the land board's work with other DNR agencies.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, commissioners. We had a great time yesterday. I appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you guys and see so much of the land board's work here in El Paso County. My name is Vanessa Mazel. I'm a policy advisor with the Department of Natural Resources, as Director Ryan mentioned, here to give the update for the department on behalf of our executive director, Dan Gibbs. High level department highlights. It's notable that the state has officially rescinded its COVID-19 vaccination requirements. And so the department will no longer be requiring vaccination status of its employees. As you know, fiscal year 2022-23 is well underway, but we are gearing up now to weigh in or to feed into the governor's fiscal year 2023-24 request that will be released publicly and delivered to the legislature on November 1. Lots of exciting proposals on the horizon, and we will certainly keep you updated on that. In terms of staffing updates, within the executive director's office, we'll be posting notice for 3 roles essentially in the coming, or rather 2 roles in the coming weeks. Yeah, 3 roles in the backtrack on that. We will be hiring an assistant director for energy. That notice should go up fairly soon, within the next couple weeks. That's someone we're hoping will have a specialty really in the renewable space. As you know, this is a really emerging space for all of our work across our work within DNR. And I think I mentioned last time, but I'll reiterate that Alice Horgan, who has previously been the department's legislative director, will be going on maternity leave. And so she has taken on the role previously occupied by Doug Vilsack when Doug moved over to the Bureau of Land Management. And so Alice is serving as temporarily as the state assistant director for Parks, Lands and Wildlife. And meanwhile, we will be hiring a legislative liaison to be able to backfill for her during the legislative session, because that's important. And also we should be posting notice. I think that probably the third in line will be the notice of our long anticipated tribal liaison. So that's really exciting to have that too. We're excited to have that capacity within the department. Let's see. Forest Health, moving on to Forest Health, as we mentioned earlier today in the county, in our meeting with the county commissioner, there are a number of grant opportunities right now, both federal and state. The Colorado State Forest Service is currently accepting applications through October 19th for the Forest Restoration and Wildfire Risk Mitigation, or FORWRM grant program, which is a competitive grant program designed to reduce the risk to people and property in the WUI, in the wildland urban interface primarily, and also focus on long-term ecological restoration. There's a $15 million funding pool that was approved by the legislature. And as I said, that application deadline, I believe, is October 19th. And similarly, there are federal wildfire community wildfire defense grants application period open right now through October 7th. It's quite a larger pool at $150 million. And those are to update or develop or implement community wildfire protection plans or FEMA approved hazard mitigation plans. So very important work. Also, I'll just mention that the first meeting of the federal US Wildfire Mitigation Commission, which our executive director, Dan Gibbs, was appointed to, met last month. So exciting to see that get underway and have a representation from Colorado. From CPW, from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, in terms of, I think people ask a lot about gray wolf introduction. There's a lot going on in that space. The stakeholder advisory group and technical working group had their final meetings in August, which wrapped up a 15-month-long process that will inform CPW staff as they prepare to present the draft Colorado Wolf Restoration and Management Plan to the Parks and Wildlife Commission in December. You may have caught news that a study that was discussed at last week's commission meeting described or discussed how they've zeroed in on an area kind of in south central Colorado, Rio Blanco, or sorry, not Rio Blanco, roughly kind of in and around Pitkin County, Gunnison, Delta, and Montrose counties, and then slightly north of I-70. So that area is, they determine, has sort of the highest opportunity, not just because of ecological conditions, but also lower levels of livestock as compared to other parts of the western slope where they are required to introduce the animals. So technical reports from the two working groups will be available soon on the CPW website. Look out for that. CPW also just recently closed the application period for the most recent round of grants on the Outdoor Regional Partnerships Program initiative, which, as a lot of you know, is an opportunity for communities, rather counties and communities to work together and across county boundaries in particular, to plan for increases in recreation and balancing conservation interests with that. Those plans will hopefully someday feed up into a statewide conservation recreation. And I think we're finding a way to integrate climate resilience plan into this sort of also kind of getting underway right now with the anticipated hire or rather RFP being issued soon for a consultant to help with that statewide process. Also, CPW is also going to be, or just now kicking off the planning for a statewide habitat connectivity plan. And you can see why it's important for us to have some effort that can stitch a lot of these things together. We also have a natural working lands plan or strategy, I think they're calling it, framework, that will be released for public comment later this month. So, or rather later this season. For the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, the exciting news is that we received word that the Department of Interior, federal U.S. Department of Interior awarded OGCC their initial $25 million grant, essentially to stand up and kind of expand their program to reclaim and plug in wells on state and private lands across Colorado. Similarly, there will be this was passed as part of the infrastructure bill. Also, a federal program will be also getting underway, which is also very exciting and OGCC will be involved in that process as well. There's a very tight implementation window, so staff has been really gearing up to spend, to obligate funds, most of the funds by the end of this year, which is pretty nuts, and then spend by the end of 2024. Colorado Water Conservation Board, DNR from across our divisions took part in Water Congress last month in Steamboat Springs. And I'll just mention that there is the first half of the Technical Assistance Grant Program funded by HB 22-1379 just launched, and those cash grants are available to communities and nonprofits. And there's a contractor being brought on to help direct the selection portion of that program. Similarly to the wildfire space, there are a host of federal programs for community watershed assistance, water resource planning, and ecological preservation restoration. There's just a host of programs, and we are working. The department is very happy to point communities, organizations, partners to some of those funding opportunities that are coming down the pike. It's coming through on a rolling basis. And I forgot to include in my official update, but I will also mention that the Restore program, which is a partnership between GOCO, DNR, several other organizations, there's also an open grant period for that, and those are pretty significant grants as well, aiming for large-scale restoration, habitat restoration, ecological vegetation management, and ecological projects as well. At the August Mineland Reclamation Board meeting, the board had found that Rocky Flats Environmental Solutions was in violation for milling gold or without a permit. This was quite a high-profile discussion. The board was determined that they should issue a cease and desist order, and they are now requiring the operator to obtain a permit for a designated mining operation there. And we were also levied a fine and are required to pay an interim bond amount of $130,000. I think that's where I will keep things unless there are questions. I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Mr. Dean, are the mitigation grants available to individuals as well as to nonprofits and reliefs from the government?
For the wildfire mitigation related grants? Yes, I will say that the state's mitigation grants are open to I don't think that they're open to private individuals. They're open to NGOs and communities and other state agencies. However, there are a number of opportunities that are opening up, in particular on the federal side, for private land fire mitigation and vegetation management. So if there are folks who are interested, contact the Department of Natural Resources, and we're happy to match you, or happy to put you in touch with the right folks at the State Forest Service. Yeah, I will say that the one thing I also didn't mention is that the Congress just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, yet another acronym to keep track of. And there's a significant amount. It will significantly expand some of the programs that were funded by the Infrastructure Fund, bring additional resources to those, as well as a lot of new programs. I was thinking maybe if there's interest, we'd be happy to provide an update on how these various federal sources of funding are getting underway. Oh, I didn't scroll down far enough. I did want to just mention that there are 3 processes underway that were initiated by the Bureau of Land Management within the state of Colorado. The first is the Greater Sage Grouse revision of the Resource Management Plan Amendment up in the Northwest. And that scoping was completed for that in the spring, and they are starting to have cooperating agency conversations that DNR is participating in. Also, a Gunnison Sage Grouse range-wide Resource Management Plan Amendment just completed scoping to help plan for that species, which is already included as threatened on the endangered species list. And that involves about 7 counties in Southwest Colorado. And the BLM also just completed scoping for a statewide big game we're calling it a big game resource management plan amendment, which is a pioneering effort really to plan for habitat connectivity and permeability for big game species across the state, across all the field offices in the state. So there's a lot going on.
There it is. Thank you. Appreciate you, Vanessa.
Thanks.
All right, we're going to shift gears to business items. And the bulk of this meeting really is reviewing this very important decision. We're able to spend some time looking at the various sites that we'll be discussing today, and Greg and his team have put together a terrific packet of set of series of information issues for us in our packet. So much appreciation. I know that work alone was a lot of work. And then yesterday's tour really brought the whole picture forward for us. So I'm going to turn to Greg.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk about, we're on information item A, Colorado large scale electric opportunity.
So, good morning, Commissioners. Greg Okish, Assistant Director. As Commissioner Scanlon just said, this is really a recap in some ways of yesterday's tour. In a way, it's an information item. We're not going to ask you for any decision today, but we wanted to take the time to hear your thoughts and observations about what you saw yesterday, give you a sense of what we think the next steps are, and find out what additional information you may need from us before we do ask you for a decision later this year, probably in November. I know we have a number of guests in the room that are here to listen and participate in this conversation. I thought it might be useful. Could everybody who's here for this raise your hand so you get a visual, and then maybe could you go around and just introduce yourself and.
We can hear you.
I think we can do it from here. Yeah.
Matt Moorhead with the Colorado Program of the Nature Conservancy. Ed Anderson with DMTF. Patrick Gardner with Trust Public Land.
Hannah Redmond, Western Public Land. Hi, Amy Kelly with the 10th Air Base Wing of the U.S. Air Force Academy.
Keith Klein, Chairman of the DMTF. Dick Tanner, Bohart.
Nate Tanner, Bohart Ranch.
Steve Zettelmoyer, Zettelmoyer Ranch.
Thanks. And towards the end of this, I think anybody who's interested in speaking will be given an opportunity. So yeah. So I think big picture, as we've talked about this is really an opportunity for the land board to create achieve some permanent protection of some of the important natural values that we've recognized on our landscapes over the years, and achieve as well some of our strategic financial outcomes. I think that's the what's in it for us part. There's clearly, as we talked yesterday, many intersecting interests here, and we think that if this is done right, it will achieve outcomes for the military installations in Colorado, for the ag community, the conservation community, for a number of others. It's a clicking thing. So very briefly, this shouldn't take that long, but why now? Why are we doing this now? Brief history of the board discussions to date, what lands are subject to the proposal. You saw all of that yesterday, but I'll recap them in one slide on a map. Matt will talk briefly about how would we accomplish this if we go forward, and then there'll be an opportunity for the folks in the room to speak, and then for the board to ask questions or give us your feedback. And you're welcome to ask questions and provide feedback as we go. So why now? And I touched on this. There's really, I think, a convergence of challenges and interests that have come about. The population growth and development in the state is a factor. The fact which is affecting the military installations and their ability to operate, increasing land values, which becomes a challenge for the agricultural community and touches on agricultural sustainability. Our interest and others' interest in stewardship and conservation, and a little bit public recreational access. We've, as we talked yesterday, have increasing interest in making state trust lands available to the public on a 24/7 basis. That's not really our mission. Sometimes it aligns, sometimes it doesn't, but I think some of the entities that may take possession of these lands from us or moving forward, dispose of them to third parties may help with this aspect a little bit. And then I think importantly, there's a couple of tools that have become available. The REPI program, can I go backwards? Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration is a funding program that really becomes the seed money and more to make this feasible at this time. And then secondly, why might we do it? Well, we've recently reinvestment options in the permanent fund have become available to us that historically haven't been. So the ability to invest in stocks and other financial instruments that earn a higher return than what our land holdings might earn. All of this together, I think, sort of becomes the why now part of this conversation. Benefit to the trust, certainly, as I just touched on, there's the financial support of K through 12 education and the possibility of earning higher returns than we do by holding and the land and leasing it. And then a lot of indirect benefits that are aligned with our mission. Some of these landscapes, the Bohart Ranch in particular, we have in the Stewardship Trust because we've recognized the natural values and the importance of the natural values on that ranch. But the Stewardship Trust isn't permanent protection. And this initiative would place conservation easements on these properties that would represent permanent protection. We think we can achieve an outcome with some of our partners, Colorado Cattlemen's and some of the land trusts that would allow this to support long-term agricultural use of these lands, maintain the stability of the local agricultural communities, and again, perhaps provide public access and use on some of these properties. I'm usually better at this. Here, I can do this. Can't do this. Is that first? Okay. Little history of the board timeline. The first discussion, I think, was as long ago as November 2019. That was really sort of an introduction to the issue and what lands were affected. In March 2020, this is the infamous pre-COVID tour. The last public meeting before COVID shut everything down, like the day after. Property tour. This is actually where the board took the first steps to initiate the transfer of 640 acres inside the boundaries of the base at Schriever to the DOD. We're still working to get that done, but it's getting close. The board directed staff to develop a strategy for the disposal of the Bohart Ranch. And then we actually developed a military lands policy that I think has been successful in letting us communicate more effectively with the various installations when we are proposing to do something different with our lands adjacent to those facilities. And then November 2021, the representatives of TNC and TPL were back in front of you and wanted to share with you that in investigating how we might accomplish the transfer of Bohart Ranch into other hands, they had received a lot of support for a larger scale effort. And those were the lands we toured yesterday, that there was a lot of support at DOD and Washington, DC to, I think you may have heard the term, pursue a mega REPI strategy, which is what we're going to talk about today. This is the map that was in your packets yesterday. The state trust line is in blue. The green semicircle are the aerial training maneuver areas that for the Air Force Academy that you heard about. The red line denotes the land that is part of this discussion at each of those properties. And our tour, it was fun after I put this together, our tour changed. So it's not in order, but we saw the Bohart Ranch, which is the largest property subject to this. We saw the Edison property, Big Springs, the land to the south of Schriever Air Force Base, Aiken Canyon Preserve. Some of us, those who had not seen it before, stopped and visited at the end of the day yesterday. And then the Table Mountain properties that are of interest to Fort Carson. So totaling that up, it's about 75,000 acres of surface acres. It's 68,000 acres of minerals, which in all likelihood would not be transferred, but we would have to make accommodations to either continue to access those or agree to some sort of non-development agreement if they were not to be not at, if we were not going to access them for a period of time going forward. This includes some information that wasn't in your package. We broke the approximate annual lease revenue down by property, and you'll see that, and we touched on this yesterday on the site, that a little bit surprising to me that Table Mountain is actually earns the most annual lease revenue, and that's greatly a function of the two solid mineral operations there. I don't know if you got any questions about this, since there's some new information. So the next piece, I'm going to let Matt talk about, so how would we do this? If we move forward, what would that look like?
Thank you, Greg. Matt LaFontaine, Acquisition Disposition Manager. This is certainly a different program than we typically have pursued in the past, both in terms of scale and in some of the objectives, which means that it would be designed a little bit differently from a disposition perspective. Statute requires that the board publicly notice and solicit competitive bids on any disposals. What we would do in this instance is merge that concept with our noticing of a purchase option or a sale via purchase option, which would allow for two important aspects of this particular program. One, it would provide TNC and TPL as a partner in this transaction, or other parties, the ability to gain a level of control over the land needed to obtain and line up the REPI financing. Secondly, the REPI financing comes in waves. For example, it's our understanding that right now, the Air Force Academy has approximately $6 million of REPI funding available, and that could potentially be used for a phase of the Bohart disposal. That would only amount to a fraction of what would be required to do the transaction for the entire Bohart. Further, appropriate use of REPI funds can be used by those installations to receive more and larger slices of REPI funding in the future. So our general idea would be to arrange this such that the individual DoD interest sites could be disposed of in phases over time and at the installation priority level. Each of these purchase options would be noticed with a minimum bid of $50,000. This would ensure that not only are we attracting only a qualified and able to perform pool of potential buyers, but also that there's an initial upfront investment that the board has as consideration. That would essentially be the fee for the purchase. That would become creditable to the first phase's closing, but in the event that we made it this far down the road and there was no subsequent closing, that would be forfeited, go to the board as consideration for going through this process. Disposals would occur at appraised values at some time in the future, understanding that all of the REPI funding is not currently arranged, and 99% of the REPI funding is not currently arranged. So those appraisals would occur within 12 months of the actual transaction dates for each phase. Also, in accordance with both statute and board practice, standard board reservations would remain. We're considering that our subsurface estate right now, as well as Denver Basin groundwater reservations. Although that one is a matter of board policy and not statute. Lessees would have their 118 rights as exist under their current leases. We've talked briefly with TNC about the potential for those lessees to also have a ability to or a right of first refusal on the back end of the transaction post easing. And let me take a step back here because I think that's an important general idea. The general idea is the board would sell its assets to, in this case, TNC TPL partnership. TNC TPL would then put a conservation easement on the property. Their funding for the initial acquisition being a combination of REPI funding and their own raised funds. At the end of that process, they would then dispose of the eased property back into private, most likely private hands. So that second concept where I just talked about a right of first refusal for lessees, existing lessees, is a potential that we're looking at for the back end post eased transaction. I know that was kind of a lot. I'm not sure that I talked to it super logically. So if there's
I
questions.
would just add
now would
one
be
other
the time.
point before we take questions. That second bullet is important. We talked through, if we advertise this purchase option, we have all these goals we want to accomplish. And somebody could come in, take the option and purchase the ranch. A developer could come in and purchase the ranch, and that would negate all of this work. So the option will require that a conservation easement that will be attached as an exhibit be executed on the property by the buyer. We haven't quite figured out how to make that happen, but it'll be a requirement of the acquisition. So if somebody else buys it and is willing to put that easement on it, we still achieve our probably most of, if not all of our goals. And TNC and TPL can go on to the next property under the REPI program. So we're trying to make sure there's a way to ensure the outcome we want. So. Commissioner Pro.
Thank you. For clarity, so it's an option for property rather than a master option with phases built into it for each piece of property.
Correct, that's our current construct. As we envision right now, the board authorization, should it come in November, would be for us to proceed in that manner on a per property basis over a period of 10 years, as can be arranged with the REPI funding and the various phases.
And that the reason to structure it that way is because you've got 3 branches of the military that you're dealing with, and because of the uncertainty of the REPI funding amounts. Is that
correct?
Correct.
That is correct. The uncertainty and the accessibility of the REPI funding and the fact that, you know, since we're talking over long periods, potentially long periods of time, subject to the whims of a recession and potential drying up of funding from our perspective.
And how is this structured so that towards the example you used was the Bollard, and that will need to be taken down in phases as funding is available. How do we know that phase 1 doesn't get taken down and we still end up with phases 2 and 3 because either the federal funding, you know, the REPI funding dries up, or TNC
Can I take a crack at that?
changes your focus or whatever it is. What's this? What happens if this stopped in the middle?
I think the answer we'll give you, and then I think it's a good question for TNC, is we don't. I mean, we think it's very unlikely, and they can explain why, but there is a possibility that we might end up selling 1/3 or 1/2 of one of these properties and still hold the rest.
Can I add one thing on that? We've identified this as a potential risk going forward, and we would design the phases in the most appropriate manner for the board. So in this case, in Bohart, we see the most valuable land in a lot of ways, and certainly to the Air Forces being the piece on the north where the bullseye is, we would progress through phases from south to north.
Would you reappraise every few years? Is that how?
Every per our board policy, all appraisals are effective for a period of up to 2 years. What we've proposed in this instance is ensuring that appraisals are current within 1 year of each phase.
I know it'll become more clear in November. Is the Bohart the only one that actually in an option would likely have 2 or 3 phases? The rest are smaller. Are those all going to be phased closings for the different agencies?
And I think my take, and please jump in if you disagree, Matt. It depends on the property, but in general, what we'd like to do is set a lower limit for both size in terms of acreage and purchase amount. In other words, we're suggesting under this construct that a minimum phase would be either $5 million in value or 10,000 acres, accepting closeout phases. But it would be a product of how much REPI funding was available at any given time for that installation.
I think the others, and again, when our guests come up, we could ask them again. I think it's possible some of the others would be in phases.
I have a question about timing and the financial part of it. So would there be a conservation easement placed first?
So conservation easement would be placed prior to TNC and TPL's subsequent disposal to a private party. It wouldn't be put in place at the time of our disposal, and our appraisals wouldn't be valued subject to that conservation easement. So that would all occur under their ownership.
Right, and so if we're advertising this, it would not be with the conservation easement on it?
It would not be with a conservation easement on it, but there would be a stated requirement that a subsequent owner in place one. In a
Requirement that there would be one placed on it.
correct.
And then secondly, I'm interested in the timing versus surety about funding. So how do we know that there will be available REPI funding for those portions that we intend to put on?
I think it's a good question for TNC, and maybe we could wrap up our piece of this and get TNC and TPL at the table to answer some of those questions. Okay, so let me see if I've got anything else here. Project partners, we talked about TNC, TPL, Palmer Land Conservancy, who you met yesterday on our tour, Colorado Cattlemen's as well, with an interest in ensuring these lands stay in agriculture. And so I'll turn it over to the partners, and you guys can do that in any order you'd like. And then also I'd like to leave some time for our lessees. So.
If you could just give your name and affiliation with the record.
Nice to see you today. Matt Moorhead again with the Nature Conservancy here in Colorado.
Patrick Gardner with Trust for Public Land.
Would it be helpful to start with answering some of the
I
questions that I
think
was?
it'd be terrific. And
was hearing.
any other information you share with us.
Okay. So I think probably the overriding, and I think legitimate question that I'm hearing as well is the level of risk or certainty associated with the federal funding to really, that is sort of catalyzing this whole concept. Given the future unpredictabilities of politics and economic circumstances, there is no absolute guarantee on this. But both Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy have longstanding experience working with Department of Defense partners across the country on REPI projects, and actually even predating the REPI program projects that led to the creation of REPI. And essentially what we have seen over that time is a consistent pattern that as REPI has been a very cost-effective tool for insulating and securing bases that are worth, in most cases, billions and billions of dollars, that congressional funding support and internal Department of Defense support for continued funding of REPI has just continued to grow over time. One of the other patterns that we have seen is, everybody's human, so this is a normal human thing. Success tends to breed success. So with initial funding that can kick off a project, as well as essentially the legal documentation, in this case, an option agreement, we're talking about contracts, et cetera. The legal ability of conservation partners and the Department of Defense to demonstrate we have the secure legal opportunity to deliver on these goals that will have these material benefits to these multi-billion-dollar installations, as well as, depending upon where the project is, the cascading other civic benefits, conservation, agriculture, security, engagement with nature, et cetera. What we've seen is that with those security, when a project gets that in place and it successfully launches, it tends to be receive regular and consistent support until the project is complete. We've seen that with TPL here in Colorado at Buckley Air Force Base. We've seen that through the Nature Conservancy with very large projects on the southern and southeastern borders of Fort Carson, which of course is now looking at its western border. But there is a long track record of that success. Here in Colorado, we feel that, again, nothing can be 100% guarantee, but what we are all discussing is the sort of thing that already has the attention of each of the branches of the military and is strongly supported by the Department of Defense that runs the REPI program. So. With that, if there's additional questions on that, or
Can I throw in a comment?
Sure.
Why don't you take a seat, introduce yourself then?
Yes.
Oh,
Exactly. We need to know who you are.
Keith Klein, Chairman of the Defense Missions Task Force, and Amy, you can correct me if I'm wrong here on this, but when we talk to the DoD about this, when we make applications by their deadlines on an annual basis for this sort of funding, right from the start, they're fully aware that this will be an iterative process, that this is phase 1 of 2, 3, 4, or 5. So they enter into that understanding and that agreement to fund that first iteration, knowing there are follow-on iterations. Granted, the funding is subject to the whims of Congress in any given year. It's possible that they limit it. It's also possible that it gets plussed up in midstream. And it is a competitive situation across the nation for these funds. Putting together packets, the sorts of that you guys have done here, meeting with the right DoD officials as we have done, and as we'll do again in about 6 weeks to keep them abreast of it. All of these things will bode well for us in these iterative efforts.
And Keith, this is
Yes.
Fred Oakridge, Assistant Director. I think it's also, that was what you heard in Washington, was the scale of this made it a very attractive, in terms of competitiveness, the scale of this effort made it very competitive.
Very interesting to them. I thought was the reception, my takeaway from their reception.
there's an efficiency component to this. As some of you recall, some of may have heard this for the first time. When TPL and TNC were working with the land board initially just on the Bohart property with the Air Force Academy, that's when we really started learning that the other installations were having independent, separate conversations around their own REPI and buffering needs with the state land board without sort of the without some of the expertise and partnerships already established at the table. And so by really going from there and stitching together conversations, recognizing that these are all entities, the Department of Defense, needing to talk to a single seller in the state land board about a comprehensive slate of issues. That's another thing we've heard makes this attractive is yes, it's larger in scale, but it's comprehensive in trying to catalyze a broad set of solutions across their issues here in the state of Colorado.
Yes, so following on my question about phasing, so there's money available now, as I understand, from the Air Force Academy. And that money would be available immediately in a competitive process, or help me understand just the mechanism for some sense of surety on this.
Yeah, that money's in hand essentially or committed. Yeah.
Yes.
It needs to spend through the competitive process and we've secured those funds. We being USAFA.
And the amount again is.
Just shy of
$6 million. So it competes only within this plan for which phase of the operation should it be applied to.
I see.
It's not competitive, big picture. It's competitive, one priority versus the other for the Air Force Academy.
Part of the role that TNC and TPL have here as well under REPI programs, the REPI is part of the competitive nature. It's not just competitive per installation, it's also competitive because there are match dollar requirements that go to that. So the just shy of $6 million the Air Force Academy has, TNC and TPL will be identifying and bringing other match dollars to the table. At least 25% of an overall project cost, ideally a little bit more than that as well. Colorado's longstanding success in
creating funding sources for conservation and the just tremendous support for conservation in the state of Colorado. That's another competitive advantage that we have here compared to many states around the country in competing for REPI dollars, in that we have a very strong track record and lots of energy behind supporting the conservation outcomes as well as the military mission outcomes.
Yeah, and our experience has been, so this first 6 million that we have with REPI and then our match, take down phase one, we then submit another proposal with the Air Force to the REPI DoD program requesting more funds. And by having a first phase taken down, that greatly, increases our ranking for more funding for subsequent years. So that's part of how they review the proposals of what's been done so far at this installation. So taking down first phase, the chances of our funding is going up quite a bit.
Amy, you guys already have an application in for another round, correct? As does Schriever for what would be their first iterative deal, right? So these things are rolling. They are already rolling by the bases. They've already put their necessary things to work. And it's all actually part of the plan that you're seeing before you.
Yeah, and that's kind of how TPL did it with Buckley. The first pot of REPI funding we got was competitive, and then subsequent years, we never had any problem getting additional funding. We had already taken down some pieces of the land around Buckley, and we received funding every year after that. We ended up receiving around $30 million in REPI funding over that 10-year period.
That was a very similar outcome with the Nature Conservancy's work with Fort Carson. And matter of fact, very similar numbers as well, about roughly $30 million over the course of, I want to say about 5-6 years.
And so this strategy is what's dictating which phases, what areas we've identified first, last. It's related to this funding idea that once we get in, we can keep rolling with it.
Right. I think you pick each installation is going to pick sort of a starting parcel to start to roll through based on their individual mission priorities. I think Matt LaFontaine also mentioned, I think, an important point here. And that is that the partners in the State Land Board should also be working with the military on design, understanding the military's priorities, but also understanding that while nobody expects this to happen, if something does happen with regard to the funding stream, let's design each phase such that it essentially minimizes the ownership and operational challenges for what may be left for the State Land Board. So they still have assets that make sense for the State Land Board in the future.
Just for comparison, Patrick, on Buckley, how many acres did you guys conserve?
That's a good question. That was predating. That was with Hillary Merrick who ran that project, but several thousand acres along the edge of Buckley Air Force Base.
And Matt, you mentioned you did 30,000.
We were between 30 and 35,000 through REPI. Yes.
Matt, who ends up holding fee title to those acres? Were you simply buying an easement in those instances and the existing rancher sold the easement and kept fee title, or did TNC take title and then sell it to a conservation buyer?
In those instances, and I don't know for sure on Buckley, but with the Fort Carson, those were two private landowners who were interested in the conservation easement option. And so we were able to just work with them directly, and they both retain ownership today and continue to operate ranching on those privately owned properties.
So I was just going to say, there's Matt. I'm not sure if we're going to. It comes up in our questions at the end of some questions we put in your memo. We could simply use the property and hold it. Historically, previous boards have not been interested for a variety of reasons, and we get into it too. Easy state trust land and holding them for the long term. So we've been pursuing this as a disposal strategy. That doesn't have to be the strategy on every property. We could choose different courses on different properties, but I just want to make that.
My understanding, just in response to that, it's in our interest though not to do that. As Matt mentioned, that the appraisal will come in without the easement, and that would probably serve us better in this process. Is that correct?
If we were to hold it, and I might let Matt speak to this, we would get a conservation appraisal. We would be compensated to that value, and so we would have the ranch on a we'd hold the ranch up with a diminished basis.
We would still need someone though to want to work with us on that as well.
Yes, yeah, I would still try to do it through our
The same
partners, that was the
I
part
do.
we identified, but it
Yeah,
just historically, the
I
board
get it, yeah.
was not interested in that. And so when we launched this 2 years ago, we said to our partners, you're gonna have to figure out how to buy a simple land from us, and ease it after you have it. That was a direction from us.
Yeah, the way the REPU program is written is that it can be used for easements or fee, but the typical approach is to lesser property interest to achieve the goals of the program, to make sure it's protected for trading and installation purposes. So most of the time REPU is used just to purchase an easement, but in this case, we've approached it using it for fee. With
Interesting, okay.
TPL and TNC guaranteeing there'll be some permanent protection on the ranch at the end of the day. So the Air Force has some assurance that we're not just gonna buy it and then develop it. Yeah.
Commissioner Porter, can I, at this point, we heard about the Air Force and Schreiber in terms of the funding cycles. I assume they're annual. And what about Fort Carson?
They are, Fort Carson is slightly behind in terms of the, essentially the planning and implementation of this. Of course, they do have a track record. They've had some recent staff changes, but Fort Carson has made it very clear from Department of Defense, from Secretary of the Army's office on down to, at this point, a succession of garrison commanders at the installation, that they are committed to this, and they are in the planning and catch-up phase to where Schriever and the Academy are.
The Army was Fort Carson in particular, was way out in front on these sorts of things 20 years ago.
Yes.
It is one of the most buffered bases in our nation. But this strip remains along the western side there along 115. Each of the bases would approach prioritizing their deals differently. For the Air Force Academy at Bullseye, it may be the landing area and the flight training areas, some of which have already been lost to encroachment by wind turbines, for instance. Schriever's is probably the threat of development, the threat of the line of sight things I talked about yesterday. As we stood with our back to the base and looked to the south and southwest and southeast, that may be their primary concern, and they'll adjust or identify their priorities based upon their mission requirements and the worries they have about encroachment upon that mission. No different for Fort Carson, right? That parcel along the west there. Frankly, the leases to the quarries have caused them no small amount of concern and frustration with the increased truck traffic that it represents, the dust that they represent, the safety that it represents getting to and onto and off of that road, and the number of fatal accidents that occur on that stretch. And not to mention the possibility for additional development there, which, because it's right across the road from their impact zone, it's a very loud place to live. And it's a great flight training route for them, or a necessary flight training route for them through there. And it would result in, and we expect, a lot of difficulty with whomever might choose to live there. Not to mention the water issues and all those things. It might.
Impact zone, you mean where they're landing rounds?
No, the impact zone for the artillery and the tanks and the helicopters is just across the road and to the south of there. I mean, I can hear those rounds from my home in Briargate. That's this part of town. And at certain times, if the wind's in the right direction, certain times of night, you can hear that boom, 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 all the way. I mean, it's 20 miles removed. So you can imagine being a mile removed to that. You'll be able to hear reveille and retreat. Let's put it that way. You'll want to stand at attention morning and night. Anyway, each of the bases will approach their prioritization of those iterative processes differently. And Fort Carson's may or may not even be an iterative process. Schriever for sure, the Academy for sure. But I just want to throw that in there.
Just looking at the time here, the strip. Would you have other guests? Would you like to?
Yes, I was gonna ask.
Okay.
Can I ask Matt one more question for you?
Sure.
We know that the Nature Conservancy has a long successful track record of buying up private property easing it and then finding another buyer that shares your interest, a conservation buyer.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're envisioning here. But you've described that as being a little bit different than the other transactions you already did on the south end of Fort Carson, where you had a rancher who wanted to keep the fee and you were just buying the easement.
Right.
Does the difference in structure change the match requirements in any way? And does it place a heavier burden and reliance on the ability of TPL and TNC to bring funding to the table than the earlier transactions you've done at Fort Carson?
It doesn't change the match requirements. The match requirements, as Patrick said, the requirements, you could buy different sorts of property interests. The minimum necessary to meet the military mission. So in this case, we're talking fee simple, as that has been the guidance we've gotten from the staff and commissioners in the past. It could also be conservation easements, but the match requirements apply to whichever property interest you find yourself acquiring. So from a challenge perspective, if we're buying fee simple, the match requirements are substantially higher than they are if we're purchasing conservation easements. So to that degree, yes, it means more work for the Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy, and a greater tap into conservation and community support and development resources here in Colorado. If I could say just one thing in terms of the track record the Nature Conservancy has in terms of being able to purchase properties where an owner is interested in selling but not interested in the conservation easement, and then sort of selling those out to a new owner. For the most part, our track record over the last 15 years, with one significant exception, for the most part, when we do that, we have found ways to transfer those properties back out into private land ownership, where they continue as operating functional ranches, since most of this work is in Eastern Colorado. That would be our goal for the majority of the properties here. And I believe, as it was noted, Colorado Cattlemen have been involved in this discussion as well. Partly there is interest in seeing if we can find a way to make that more financially feasible for traditional agricultural owners to do so. So yes, we are looking, the concept is a conservation buyer program, but we are hoping to use this as an opportunity to actually see if we can address some of the disparate land values versus agricultural values.
And I think the other thing, not in addition to just the amount of money we'd have to match for fee simple versus easement, it's just going to take longer to do that because the amount of years will take to raise the money and the phases that we'll have to go through. But I think the one advantage is, at the end of the day, when TPL and TNC do sell to a private owner, the money that will come back in will be repurposed. So, Big Springs and Edison, if those are next up, likely with the amount of money we'll sell Bohart for, we can essentially, roll that into Big Spring and Edison and just repeat that. Hopefully without having to do any phases on those to their size. Yeah.
I would just open it up. Who else would like to share your perspective?
We do have some of our lessees here. That'd be great.
Sure. Thank you all.
Thanks. Thank you. You need to.
I've got a plane to catch you.
Okay. I think, unless you have other questions for Keith, we could let him go.
Well, we've got some prepared.
Oh, okay. Do you want to, I'm sorry.
We'll let you. That's right. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you. Don't mind me if you see yourself.
Yes, Nate Tanner, I'm the lessee on the Bohart sublease from TNC, and so we run the cattle operation and have been lessee with TNC for right at 25 years now. I appreciate your time and being able to speak here today, and also to be on the tour yesterday and hear that conversation. And as I stated yesterday, I think there's a lot of common goals that can be reached in a project like this, and meet the goals of a lot of the different groups that are involved in this. I do support the idea of a conservation easement on the ranch. I like the idea of seeing it protected long-term and remaining in agriculture, especially considering all the pressure that is surrounding it. And that's why the Air Force is wanting protection from that encroachment as well. I think all those things are in common. Every group also has their common core goal in this. And to be honest, of course, our common goal in this is to remain in business. I have a lot of intrepidation about this project, even though I support a lot of the goals of it. One of my greatest concerns at this time is we don't have any information to make any kind of a business decision on, is this, if we move down this road, are we going to be able to remain in business there? You know, what are the price points going to be? What is REPI going to cover? Ultimately, what price point are we going to be looking at when this project is over? And can we meet that? So that's a great concern to us, and very fearful that we don't have hardly any of that information at this point. So that from that aspect, it makes it very difficult to say, I support going forward with it. That being said, you know, I also am very interested in hearing some more discussion on the idea of the land board retaining ownership with an easement on it. And of course, my position from that is I see that as a much more likely, more feasible way that my family can remain in business. So I would encourage some thought and some discussion into that possibility. Again, just to finish, I want to say I think there's some very great groups from Air Force and TNC. Cattlemen's do have a big stake in trying to work on the financial ag finance aspect of this. And I know they can bring a lot to the table and the discussions. So I think there's some great people involved in this and can have some great outcomes. I just would encourage you, please go at it very carefully and thoughtfully. And I certainly will try and be there for every step of the process and hope to be there at the end. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So before you leave.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
So I have that question too. And if the final outcome is to preserve this for agriculture, you know, when all of these processes come to their final point, will there be the resources there for folks like you and others in Cattlemen to actually then lease these properties? Can you afford it? And in that conversation with Cattlemen or others, you know, what's been the conversation? Will that still need subsidies, or what are people saying will be the way that this could work financially?
Well, of the discussions that I've heard, you know, there are the possibilities of trying to gain funding from places to bring the price point down on trying to purchase the property. There's been some discussion of partnerships too. If TNC, when they are ready to sell the property with it, he's putting together a partnership through CCA that would have ownership of that and be able to bring that to an affordable lease rate. Quite frankly, I'm not worried about the lease rate. It's the purchase price that is the problem for agricultural people to make. You know, lease rates are going to be based on a production value of some kind. Currently, just straight land purchase price has very little to do with production value. And that's where agriculture, particularly in areas that are increasingly going up in value, that value very quickly so far passes the production value of that property that it makes it unfeasible to own that property. And so that's the kind of things that not just on this project, there's been several other projects, and I wouldn't speak to them in the details, but that have been done in properties in trying to bring that down to a production value. And there's been many different things that have been tried. And so that would be a pretty long discussion. But I know that CCA is on board to have those discussions.
I know Kate's got a presentation they want to make, it's on schedule, so I was gonna say, I'm not trying to cut out Nate, but before we extend this part, because of the military finishing.
Absolutely.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much.
Important considerations.
Keith, I'm gonna turn it over to you, whoever you'd like to have, like.
Keith Klein and Lieutenant General Ed Anderson. So greetings to all of you. Christine, congratulations on your chairmanship, I guess. Is that the right, is that the right term? And the other commissioners, Bill and Greg, and the rest of the team. It was great to see you again yesterday and to reconnect in person with the many of you I hadn't actually seen for about 2.5 years. I'm glad to observe that just like me, none of you had aged a bit. Not a bit. So for the record, I am Keith Klein, chairman of our Defense Mission Task Force, and I've had the real pleasure of working with the State Land Board staff and our conservation partners and our bases for several years now on various initiatives, most recently on those which are before you today. I'm sure you'd be glad to hear that I will not be boring you with a repeat of all that we covered on the ground yesterday. Now, I know that in the past, we've brought before you active commanders of our bases, and I'm confident we'll get to do that again in the future. But today, my primary responsibility is in having the genuine honor of introducing a great friend, mentor, and colleague with a global big picture perspective on these matters. And that would be Lieutenant General Ed Anderson. He's a West Point graduate and a veteran of 39 years Army service and a former commander of our nation's Space and Missile Defense Command. He also served as the Deputy Commander for the U.S. Northern Command and Vice Commander for the U.S. element of the Northern Aerospace Defense Command. Since his retirement from active duty, he has lent his expertise to a number of boards and continues to do so, boards of directors, and was the interim director for the National Cybersecurity Intelligence Center and was the executive director of strategic military science, space, and security initiatives for the University of Colorado here in Colorado Springs. Suffice to say, we'd have a difficult time finding a better authority on the importance of what is before you today as it impacts our services than our friend Lieutenant General Ed Anderson. Take it away, sir.
Thanks very. And welcome, and thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Keith. I wish my grandchildren could be here to hear that. And I want to say I love the picture.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Just leave that on there. It's very, very appropriate. I can relate to that very, very easily.
Probably arranged to have the intervention recording intervention sent to
you. Thank you. That would be great. Well, I must say there is some risk, Keith, that your introduction will exceed the length of my remarks. So I do want to clarify one thing. As he said, I am a graduate of West Point Military Academy. So it goes without saying, beat Air Force, beat Navy. Sorry, Amy. But I will also clarify that to tell you that I root for Air Force and Navy every day but one. So good morning, Commissioners, Director Ryan, and your rest of your team, and to the conservation partners who also are here in attendance. It really is a genuine pleasure for me to be here. So thank you for inviting me. You know, you all and we have been working on this for quite a while. It really has. And there have been some remarkable accomplishments that have been achieved. And thanks to your efforts. I well remember attending an initial meeting that Keith had arranged about 5 years ago with Commissioner Butterworth at the time, Director Ryan, Mr. Ochish, and a couple of others from the community, where we began the conversation about where our defense-related interests intersected with those of the State Land Board. and how we might work together for our mutual benefit. It really was the driving factor. In the years since I've followed with great interest the progress that you are making and achieving on these multiple initiatives, you're working on together, and I've noted the tremendous work accomplished by your professional staff. And so let me just say hats off to them for the important work that they do and are doing on this engagement, as well as that which they do day in and day out for the benefit of all of us. Moving on to the subject at hand today, I did have the opportunity to review the proposal and the very impressive package that was put together by our conservation partners, working in concert with your team and with the support of our community partners. I'm aware that in that process, they have visited the leadership of each of the bases and the senior leaders, some senior Department of Defense officials, while doing their due diligence to ensure they're on the right track. Certainly the outcomes that you are working for are critical. And I emphasize critical to the viability of our military bases and their missions, as well as the local economies and the state of Colorado, for the state of Colorado as a whole. It is no overstatement to say that given the sensitive nature of the work that's being done out there, and you've seen it, you know that the work is being done from those bases for the unprecedented threats that we face today, that these efforts you are undertaking have considerable national security implications as well. I applaud you for getting out there on the ground and taking a look and asking the questions and talking to our people to see these things for yourself and to get a sense of importance, hopefully, as you consider your next steps. I am pleased that this work seems so completely aligned with your mission to fund education here in Colorado. And I'm certain Keith would agree that you may count on our continued support for this effort. We'd be happy to field some questions here this morning or at any point in the future. You may trust we will quickly defer the difficult ones to our conservation partners. So subject to your questions, I say thank you very much for giving us a little time to weigh in on this morning. So questions, please.
No, I appreciate how long this conversation has been going on.
Yeah.
Remind me of a 5-year timeframe of your engagement with us on this. This is one of the most important decisions we will be making as well.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for what you do.
Josie,
I'm just going to say that. I didn't want to too early in our discussion, but I don't think there is doubt within our word and in our visits that preserving the security, this is very important. The question is really how we might best do that.
Well, thank you for your considerations. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Bye, Sarah. Thanks.
It wasn't my intention earlier to cut me off short. Questions.
Not everyone. I think you were going to add to Dave's comment on there.
Sure, and
Or
Nate,
respond.
if you end up wanting to jump back in, well, please do.
Okay.
I think given some of the interesting of Nate's comments, I just want to give a little bit more background. So the Nature Conservancy in Colorado and actually conservation around the country has increasingly been realizing that what Nate was saying is really true everywhere. There's not an acre of ground in Colorado. I'm not aware, honestly, of an acre of ground anywhere that a cow can pay for, just on operating that cow. And what we've also, is the conservation community is looking for partners and engagement. What we've found increasingly over the years that our concern about the future of land oftentimes matches up with the concern that private landowners have about the future of land for some overlapping reasons. And then, of course, each group sort of has their own issues and concerns. And I think one of the realizations is that the valuation challenge for productive agricultural land is causing an existential concern on the part of private agricultural owners and operators. It causes challenges in generational succession and the ability to pass properties down, particularly if you have a family that is a larger family, than more than just a child or two. It also causes a challenge for those larger families or for potential new entrants into the business, people who could move to and become a part of the vested parts of rural communities in the US. So effectively, the challenges that Nate's talking about is something that the conservation community has been working closely with the ag community, and in particular the Nature Conservancy and the Colorado Cattlemen have been trying to crack the nut. And I think we really first started trying to approach this about 5 years ago and have put forward a couple of pilot projects, pilot efforts. Actually, I've spent quite a bit of time and resources on doing legal, financial due diligence, modeling, et cetera. And so I just wanted to sort of say that all the issues that Nate is talking about are issues that we are trying to find a solution for in concert with the actual agricultural community. We don't have those solutions yet. We have some really promising starts along the way, but when you're starting to look at projects the scale of something like the Bohart Ranch, this is something we can commit to try to do as a product of this project. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to work hard with folks like the Tanners, with our partners, the Cattlemen, because the numbers still have to work. And we see pathways to working on that and getting them closer, but we still don't know for sure yet if there are. So there is that risk, and I don't want to gloss over this. We want to achieve the military mission. We have different avenues to do it, and if we need to proceed from a fee simple purchase perspective, we'll commit ourselves to trying to figure out how to make this work financially for the families that rely on these properties. That's what we can do.
Appreciate those comments.
Is there anybody else who would like to speak?
Yeah. Please. You would state your name for the record?
Steve Zettelmeyer, Zettelmeyer Ranch. I lease 320 acres just right next to Schriever Air Force Base, which I'm sure you probably looked at yesterday or whatever. And but anyway, I guess just a couple of my concerns is just that, being on the small scale. I mean, I just run like 90 mama cows, and so, and I depend on that 320 acres for winter grass. I have 3,000 acres leased, mostly all private, and that's the only parcel that I have that belongs to the state. And just, I guess as far as I'm concerned with, if it just gets sold to the federal government and it turns to BLM land and I can just release it from them, I guess then it's not a really big deal. But there was just a couple of things. One was that, if that, property sold, would it be just take that 320 acres, add it into the bigger leases somewhere, and where basically blows it out of the water for somebody like me that I can't, compete with, adding it to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 acres over here and this 320 would go with that, or would we have the ability to still lease like the 320 instead of having it all added into one big land group? This is one of the big concerns that I had. And I guess the others is the land that I leased, I purchased the assets on it, the buildings, the barn on there, the well, steel corrals, and the other work, cross fences and all the stuff that I've upgraded in the last 10 years or whatever, because I've leased it for probably 20 years or more. And I just wonder what happens with those? Do I get reimbursed for those? Or if the BLM takes over or whatever, is it just like business as usual? I just send them a check instead of the state? And then listening to some of the stuff this morning is there a possibility that the federal government wouldn't buy this land, that it could be put up for bid for somebody else to come in and buy it? I guess I don't quite grasp that, understand that part of it.
I share how complicated this is. I think we should look to Greg, if you don't mind responding in brief to whoever. And we can
answer a couple
certainly,
of those, and a couple I can say I can't answer yet.
well, and we can always talk offline too, in a
That's
in a
true.
longer conversation.
Briefly, I'd say it would be our intention, if this moves forward, that we would purchase your improvements before we did any transaction with another party. So, yes, you'd be paying for improvements. I do think from all the conversations we've had, it's very, very, very unlikely that the federal government. It will be some other entity. In fact, was that on? Is that entirely off the table?
Per the REVI program, the US military cannot use REVI to actually, for the military to own it from the federal sense. There's not the other prohibition, but there's no plans.
There's no plans, right? Our intention is it would go into private hands. They could be yours, it could be somebody else's. And that's probably really have to, if the board says we're gonna go ahead with this, we're gonna have to really sit down with all of our partners and really figure out the details. And we would be keeping you in the loop. In fact, we talked yesterday that one of the next steps would be individually follow lessees, our lessees, to understand their situation and everything you just described. What you operate on, what role does this play? Where do you have deed lands, if any, and so that would be the next step.
Okay,
That helps.
yeah.
Thank you, and I appreciate you being with us this morning. There's some very good questions.
Thank you. Thanks for all your work and everything you do.
Right, anything further with this?
There were some questions in, so the big question for the board today is, we will be back in November. With a proposal that looks similar to what Matt described. What else would you want to know? What else do you need to know to be able to make a decision? A couple things for this specifically, where we've only been on a tiny part of the boulevard, it's 50,000 acre ranch, and you can see that same corner twice. Is the board interested in seeing other parts of that, and you are with their range individually, or is it? So that's a question. What else would you need? We've asked whether you need more financial information about what do we earn, how do we earn it, and I think it's probably like a detailed financial analysis of properties. And specifically we said, historically we've had boards that were really opposed to putting easements on property. This board feels differently. We would need to sort of reopen that exploration, and that would be something good to know today.
Mr. Chavez.
I would think, the information itself is just the nuts and bolts of the economics. What are the easements? What's the value of those easements? I know you don't have them today, but you have Buckley's, you have the 30,000 south of Carson. That was strictly an easement transaction. Public information we shared. Obviously you're the transparency side. Yeah, at least to get started and understanding, where it's going, what this land is worth, what's it appraised for in the area. And we don't have any.
Some sense of value.
Yeah,
Is what
exactly.
we're talking about.
I'm just gonna kind of follow on Mr. Chavez's comments. I understand probably why previous commissions or boards were not interested. We're always being confused with conservation versus stewardship anyway, and that probably was part of that reality of complicating that. My issue though is these are such unique properties that we're only considering this candidly because of the military issues surrounding it. Really, honestly, I think that's the driver to this conversation. So they, in my mind, do kind of fall into their own kind of unique category. I honestly hadn't really thought about any other pathway than the one we were already pursuing, because that's what we've been talking about. But it'd be interesting for me to do an assessment, almost a pro and con of either strategy, because this is sort of new to me to put in my head. And I honestly am not super familiar with. I get conservation easements, I understand the basics behind them, but I'm not really familiar with how that would in any way be applicable or not to this and what that might result in. Not that I want to prolong this conversation, but one of the questions I had, is there urgency around our voting on this now? Because I know that $6 million is hanging out there under a deadline. So there's some urgency there.
We have a little bit of urgency, but I think we have enough time. I'm sensing that these questions, these are kind of substantial questions, and that might beg another workshop before we ask you for a decision. We're really not holding much of an agenda in October, which is how we got to November.
Correct.
December, we usually don't do a lot of business, but we could. We were thinking that if you approve this, the transaction for the Bohart could be completed as soon as the first quarter next year. But there's some slack in that, it could slide a little bit. So that's the long answer. The short one is we could do some more work before we have to ask you for a decision. And I mean, that's fine.
I don't know where other commissioners are against.
I don't want to cut you off.
No, I just want to put it to the rest of the board around what is your thinking.
Yeah, so I have. actually a
You
lot-
have familiarity.
Well, I have some thoughts. I do have a little more familiarity too. And I don't, being a new commissioner, I don't know how much is appropriate to take up today, or I do think it's probably worthwhile to spend more time in another setting prior to making a decision. Overall, I feel like this transaction that's arisen is a great opportunity for the state land board to evaluate an opportunity. And it all comes down to, for the state land board, what are our objectives relative to the assets that are being proposed for disposition, and having clarity on that. And as of today, I do believe that it would be a very good idea to run two scenarios, one with the easement consideration to be sold, the other for the fee. And that also has implications for, as Matt and the others suggested, both for the REPI amount of dollars, it's 3 or 4 times the amount of dollars for the REPI installations, as well as for our private partners. So considerations both as to the state land board's objectives, primarily for the 2 largest assets, Bohart and Table Mountain. Analyzing both scenarios from financial as well as a social and economic, all the co-benefits that we were discussing. Let's run those to ground. What are the potential co-benefits? Harder to quantify, but still to be included in analysis.
And the continuing revenue if we kept the land.
Right, exactly, bring that in. And the other thing I'll say is, this is also not just about those assets and two alternative disposition models, but in fact, particularly with the Bohart, it's a consideration in the context of a portfolio where the state land board is heavily weighted in grassland, large grassland ranches, indeed, grassland ranches, small and large, in the portfolio, and bring kind of that 100-year view to that. And I don't want to make this an exercise that, takes us several months, but I do think the decisions, especially about a Bohart, one needs to consider the context of the entire portfolio, diversification, climate change, on and on. So.
Patrick Gardner from Just Probably, I just wanted to share that we should have a fee simple appraisal on Bohart by the end of the year. So we'll have at least an updated appraisal on what the fee simple value is. That will include, a appraised value for the easement, but we can do some number crunching based on some other projects we're working on. Obviously, we still need to get an appraisal for an easement if that's the way we move forward, but that'll at least give us a baseline of what the fee simple.
And may I add to that? Thank you, Patrick. I think that for this exercise that you've suggested, and I think we should have another workshop around having actual appraisals for that workshop
our private partners ourselves are in this business. I think there's probably some pretty good proxies we could come up with without necessary, and for discussion, without necessarily having defined value.
I mean, that would be my preference, is to start the conversation based on our best estimates, because I think
Right.
some of what you're talking about simply was the relative pro and con of an easement versus a property sale, and if you sell, where do you reinvest proceeds, and what's that look like, and if you lease, what's the revenue? I can sort of start to picture it.
I'm sorry, another consideration on this
I don't
is,
know if they explain, a commissioner can only make one request.
trying to outperform.
Okay.
The other thing I think would be helpful to have in this analysis would be, what are the alternative investment options for, again, both of the larger properties will generate substantial proceeds, albeit perhaps in a phased manner, but what does the, interim investment look like, and the long-term permanent fund type of return against what we're doing now?
So I concur with those questions as ones that are important to me as well. And I think there should be a scenario where we look at, let me just ask a question, Greg. You mentioned at the beginning of your comments that there was a policy or an idea within the land board that we would try to dispose of properties. How did I hear that in such a way? I guess because where I'm going with this is, one scenario is that we don't do anything with this except acknowledge that perhaps we all have an intent to secure the security that the military operations need, and we acknowledge that. And so I guess, the scenario we look at is, where are we on that whole spectrum? And then the second question is, why are we discussing it now? And the reason I understand is there's revenue money available. And Amy, I saw you shaking your head. And then, what happens with that is this something that we have to do, and we have to do it now because that's available? Or is there another scenario that we look at that's pretty much status quo?
I'll add that to the conversation. In brief, I would say we can always do that, and that's always an option. I don't know what I might have said, but there is no policy that we're trying to dispose of. And in fact, I think contrary to that, what I would want to say on the record is, we have no intention of sort of disposing of the land portfolio. We have been strategic, and if you go back on the slides here, it doesn't matter. What I said at the beginning is, we're not a conservation organization. Some of these lands, all of these lands, in all likelihood, would be under conservation easement, which would ensure the permanent protection. And if that's something we're interested in, that may be appealing to us, in addition to the fact that we would be able to redeploy the capital into investments with a higher return. So I think for us, it's financial. Primarily, if you look only through the prism of our mission, it's the financial returns to the K-12 education. And then secondarily, it's some benefits that we often talk about, but are hard for us to do on our own, because it's permanent conservation. We talk a lot about the protection of the local agricultural communities. This would take a step. So the other side of that, I call them the secondary benefits that I think are worth entertaining. But I'll bring them all back and talk through it more slowly.
I have a second part of this, and that is that if we were to proceed down this trail, we would need to dispose of Bohart, which is a part of the Stewardship Trust. And, I think we don't want to gloss over what that would be if we were to replace it. Do we have criteria for what we're looking for? Are we looking for a large parcels, other grazing land, for preservation of species, for diversity, for geography? And I think to the public that the use of the Stewardship Trust is something that we're really thoughtful about. I don't think we should just run through it and say immediately, all right, we know to do Bohart, we do this. So that there's some conversation that I think deserve time there as well.
I will add, I think that's a good point, and we can add to November. So it's like a discussion, as he mentioned yesterday, that a few years ago, we did a comprehensive review of the trust and set some priorities for replacement properties, albeit not on this large a scale, right? So, 600 acres here, 1,000 there. I think we can bring that all back to the board and pick up this conversation, so, and then decide what we're gonna go. You all prepared for a long meeting?
We love long meetings. No, I think Greg, you summed up sort of the points I was sort of in my head capturing. You know, we have all, they're not competing, but we definitely have some different interests in play with this, including the history of the board. So I appreciate how you summarized that. I think it's exactly some of the tensions we're feeling around any pathway forward from here. So I really endorse the idea of spending more time. This is probably one of the most important decisions we will make as a commission. So spending the time we need to, I think we should just
Maybe the other
commit
thing
to.
in November is a timeline. We can back up from the drop dead date to
Yeah.
Utilize those, the initial REPI funds. There is a clock ticking on those.
Right.
And so we can figure out how much time we do have before a decision becomes sort of a critical component. What about the tour of the boat? I just want to not leave with them.
I think that is a great idea if we can make it happen. You know, our problem is time and finding time when we can all get together. Your suggestion, maybe we do that a little bit independently. We could try as a collective to just do it, that sort of a tour, but
Maybe I could get a sense who would be interested in seeing more of the ranch before we get together in November. Which commissioners would.
Have Abe do a drone.
have
Yeah,
it,
I-
send us a-
Yeah.
Well, if you think about it and decide you would like to, we can absolutely do one-on tours. Justin and I can, Lindsay can come down and meet you or pick you up somewhere and spend a day.
That's fair.
I was just gonna offer that if, as a group or as individuals, if there's something that I can do, to help facilitate seeing some of the property or something that the board has interest in, as long as that's consistent with what you all do. Have, contact me, I'm happy to do it for you.
One more question, that is on the time frame. And Amy, I think I saw you shaking your head, yes, that on the $6 million funds, there's a clock ticking on that, and the commitment, as I understand it, is if this were to move forward, this would be the priority. Am I understanding that correctly?
I'm not prepared to speak on the record today, but I can provide some feedback to our partners.
And
Matt,
Matt, TNC Matt.
I'll speak on the record. No, Matt Moore from the Nature Conservancy. Direction of this conversation is fascinating. Actually, it's not exactly what I think any of us were.
We do this a lot.
We were expecting
Yeah,
this
talk
per
about
se. But I also understand and really appreciate the seriousness that you're all taking with this and thinking about, yes, there's the constitutional financial side, but there's also the myriad of other intrinsic values to people in Colorado associated with all of this. So I appreciate that. I think while from your all's discussion, I think there are potentially more than just two options or two directions here. What I think TPL and TNC should be doing with our partners installations is, and I think we can do this in this time frame. We have a good idea of sort of how this unfolds from a fee simple sale perspective. I think in pretty short order, we can look at how we restructure this to go straight to conservation easement as well structurally, and so we can also be thinking through the timing issues. From a certain perspective, there is significant conservation benefit in terms of time, in terms of speed, for switching to a conservation easement first model. So, even though it's not necessarily what we're expecting today, I think there are benefits for the installations in the conservation community doing so. But there's a bunch of options. So I think in that time frame, we will, at least from the conservation military perspective, be able to say how each of those could unfold for purposes of your discussion.
Keeping in mind, I just want to set the context for the board there. $6 million does have to be spent by third quarter of next year.
By the end of the federal fiscal year.
Which is
at the end of September of 2023, and which means we have to know well in advance of September 22nd.
And our
Yeah.
process, whether we're selling a piece or a fee simple interest, we have to go through our entire notice submittal. So I just to set expectations, I would say by really January or something, we should be clear. on what's we're going.
I endorse your, we need to back up from that. Some deadlines that we actually have to make a
I
decision.
have one more question. That is, Greg, when you described how this might go out for bid, you talked about it wouldn't have a conservation easement on it, but there would be some criteria that said it could only be used for certain purposes. Legally, I have a question about whether you could actually do that.
We're gonna have to figure, what I said is a little different, I think. I'm using different words. I said we would advertise it with an easement saying you will be required to place this easement on the property should you require it from us. You raise a point in practice. I don't know how we're gonna accomplish that. We'll have to figure that out, but that would be our.
Or enforce it is more than issue.
So we would have to find a way.
Yeah.
With our partners here, it's easier if they get it because we're all headed the same place. With an outside buyer, sure, I'll buy it.
Right.
Trust me, I'll buy it.
Yeah.
No, we're gonna have to figure out, we're gonna do some research and figure out how we can make that stay.
Sorry, it's Patrick Trustro. It would be similar to what you're doing if we're buying it and you're retaining the subsurface rights. It's essentially withholding other restrictions, just not in place yet. Okay, how it happens, I don't know, but I think.
Commissioner Clark, do you have any comment to offer?
As our real estate.
I know. No, I'm really taking this at, I don't think that piece would be a huge hurdle. And as far as everything else, I'm just happy to hear the direction this is all going. I'm able to stay quite quiet because I agree with everything that's been said in the direction that we're going here in terms of really understanding easement versus fee sale. But no, I wish I had some more substance to provide on that last question in particular, but I don't at this time.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think you have captured this conversation well in terms of next steps. I do want to, on the record state, we do share the military's concerns and recognize those. We want those to also be somewhat of a priority for us because we understand the security issues and other issues that are embedded in this conversation today and support trying to find a solution. It's in the interest not only of our state, but our country, and we will keep working towards that. All right.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. 5-minute break for sure. Thank you.
Did you again?
Good to see you again.
I'd like me to, I'll pick Nate's up off ready.
Madam Chair, the mics are open now.
All right, thanks. Hello, all. Let us resume our meeting, please. Take our seats. Terrific. Okay, with that, we're going to move forward in our agenda. Director Ryan, anything for the staff report?
For Commissioner Probst's benefit, we put a memo in here just to update you on some things you may have heard about previously as commissioners and some other things that the staff were accomplishing, working on during the month. Generally, I just say you all read it. Do you have any questions for me? And the one item that I would call your attention to this month that we are particularly proud of is the COSA award. The Colorado Open Space Alliance is giving the land board an award for our work on the Chuck Park project that you all visited a couple months ago when we were down that way. Abe Medina and a number of folks on our staff had important roles in that. So that's a pretty big deal, and we're excited to see our work honored there. With that, let me just open it up for questions.
Questions? With that, we'll just proceed forward. We have some business items or no final action items. Chris Smith is with us to talk through two of those. Chris, we'll turn it to you.
Great. Thank you, commissioners. Good morning. Yeah, good morning. I'm Christopher Smith. I'm the real estate section manager with the Colorado State Land Board. And I'm here today to recommend that the board extend a board order that it passed 2 years ago in September of 2020. This board order approved the disposal of 640 acres and the issuance of a 99-year mineral non-development agreement on 3680 acres directly to the federal government for assets that are held within Schriever Space Force Base. Like that. Let me try the mouse. There we go. So, so extending this board order would eliminate a board liability. Schriever.
Hard to tell from so
There. Yeah. Schriever Space Force Base, as you all know, because we toured it yesterday, is about 10 miles east of here in Colorado Springs in central El Paso County. And this is a close-up map of Schriever. Schriever is the black outline here in the center of the map. That's the entire base. And as you can see in the center of the base is a blue square. That is state land board land. And this is the most secure part of the base where most of the buildings in the base are located. I would also note that the board owns most of the minerals under the base as well, which are denoted in the yellow crosshatch here. So in 2019, several base commanders from Colorado bases addressed the board to discuss pretty much everything we were discussing in the last item on the agenda, the security of the bases. And then in March of 2020, the board toured all of these bases, including Schriever Space Force Base, which was an Air Force base at the time. And the majority of the buildings on Schriever are on state land board land pursuant to a perpetual right-of-way. Should the military ever cease to use these buildings or stop using this land for this purpose, these buildings would be functionally obsolete and we would revert back to the state land board and would cost more to remove them than the value of the land. And so that's where the liability to the board comes in. In 2020, in September 2020, the board passed a board order that approved the transfer of 640 acres of the surface estate inside the base to the Department of Defense and allowed for delaying the leasing and development of minerals inside the base. This board order number 2020-054 expires this month. And so I'm here to recommend that the board extend this for another 2 years. We do not believe there is any fiscal impact to this disposal because there's no change in use of land. And so I'm here to formally recommend the board the extension of board order 2020-054 and to delegate authority to the director to draft an order and take appropriate action consistent with the board's decision. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Commissioners? I do not see any. It's pretty pro forma, but Nick, do we have any public comment online?
Member of the public, if you'd like to make any comments to the board, please use the raise hand feature. No hands, Commissioner.
Yes. I don't think we have any public in the room.
And no public in the room.
So with that, we will need a motion. Oh, put your helpful slide back up. Silly.
Sorry.
Do you not know this?
I do not, I apologize.
Commissioner Down. I move adoption of board order number 2022-054. And delegate authority to the director, to implement this order and that appropriate action consistent with our decision.
Rather than adoption, extension.
Okay, with that amendment to approve the extension, do we have a second?
Second,
Motion from Commissioner Clark, second Commissioner Clark. With that, we'll call a vote. Commissioner Clark,
aye.
Commissioner Heath,
Aye.
Commissioner Chavez.
Yes.
Commissioner Probe, aye. And the chair votes yes, that motion passes 5-0. Chris, we're back to you.
Great, thank you all. And I will defer to Matt LaFontaine for the next item.
The first Matt in our eyes. Thank you, Matt.
The better Matt.
The better Matt, yes, indeed.
Good morning, Commissioners. Matt LaFontaine, Acquisition Disposition Manager. I'm pleased to be bringing to you today a replacement property acquisition, which is the Bear Creek Ranch, a 2,100 acre ranch in Huerfano County. All of the pictures that you see in this presentation were taken from on site, so you'll see some of the great views and vistas that the ranch has to offer. You are. Okay. So the board has broad legal authority to choose what types of real property acquisitions to pursue to complete non-simultaneous exchanges. As a reminder, a non-simultaneous exchange occurs when the board disposes of real property. Those funds get assigned in the NSE fund. And then the board has a 2-year period to purchase other real property with those proceeds. Otherwise, they'll automatically transfer to the permanent fund. The staff believes that the permanent fund is a viable investment alternative, and so only brings real property acquisitions forward when its opinion is that those are a better option for those proceeds specifically than the permanent fund. So right now, the current balance of the NSE fund is $23.3 million. Approximately $515,000 will expire and be transferred to the permanent fund through the end of this year. And then the next large transfer would not occur until next May. So this particular ranch acquisition is intriguing to staff because it satisfies not only near-term objectives, which are chiefly implementing an annual grazing leasing plan, in addition to a more traditional 5-year recreation leasing plan, but also because staff believes that this ranch is well situated for long-term value appreciation. And I should note that I have William Woolston, the field team lead, and Abe Medina, the recreation line of business managers, on the phone. If you have any questions as to detailed questions as to those two aspects of our leasing and investment plan. A couple of things to point out in this picture right here. Obviously, the gorgeous view of Spanish Peaks there. You see some water on the property. There's a couple of ponds, but also some improvements of stock wells and a large or fairly robust water distribution plan. You can kind of see right here, and I'll make reference to this when we look at the maps later. But this is called a dike wall. It's basically a high point ridge line that runs across the land. It's I think it was like an old geologic flow, and then the land has since eroded away. But it's characteristic of this part of the state and is integral to the water distribution plan that's in effect on this particular ranch. So I'd like to go into a little bit of detail on the annual grazing lease because it would be the first of its kind for the board. This has been a long-standing business goal. And the idea is, unlike our traditional leases, which are 10-year leases, this would be an annual lease. Because of that, our staff believes we would be able to achieve a higher AUM. It would be a little more management intensive, but it would also create opportunities for both the board and our leasing partners, specifically young ranchers who are interested in getting into the business, but do not have access to a 10-year state lease or do not have the initial capital requirements for a larger operation, but also as a way to provide flexibility to those already in the market who may have short-term leasing goals on a seasonal basis.
Or do we have any other leases at 1 year?
We don't. This would be the first. One thing to note on that, in pursuing this, this objective, the board and staff have determined that we wanted to do it with a new acquisition and not convert existing state trust land that was already in 10-year leases.
I would add that was an agreement we reached with CCA. It was, long story short, we reached out to industry, I shouldn't say just CCA. Reached out to industry, told them we were interested in this. They were concerned if we started converting existing state trust lands, and there's some questions about statute and how that applied. But there was generally consensus that if we were to purchase new lands, some limited amount of that going into a program like this was would benefit everybody.
And I think similar to some of the research and development we do as an organization, for example, Hydrox, we're going to try this for a little while. And we're going to see if it works. And if it does, we may want to do more. And if it doesn't, we maybe convert this to a 10-year lease or find some other use. But I think it's an opportunity for us to try something new and see if we're filling a need in the market for ranchers.
I think it's a great, for the young farmer or the young ranchers, new ranchers, will that, when you do your grading and all that, or competitive bidding, will they get an extra point or less point, whatever it is? at
As
the
a new
beginning
entrant?
rancher? Yeah.
I don't know that specifically has been considered.
I would have to go back and look at our competitive bid score sheet. Justin told me I went there.
Justin Osborne, South Central District Manager. The competitive bid score sheet as it is set up right now does award a point for young entrepreneurial ranchers starting off.
Okay, so with that, if we can go back to the map here, nice map of Colorado, you see the three major interstates, 70, 76, and then 25. And what you also see overlaid is population density. So one of the reasons that staff is particularly interested in kind of this southern Colorado area as a largely undeveloped area that may hold future additional interest and therefore appreciation potential is its proximity to I-25. And you see the 6 largest metro areas coming down: Fort Collins, Greeley, Boulder, the Denver Aurora MSA, Colorado Springs, and Pueblo. This puts about 80% of the state's population within a 4-hour drive of the prospective acquisition, which we have kind of said would be a maximum drive distance for fairly reasonably easy access. So zooming in now, we see I-25 here, Walsenburg here, which is the closest statutory city. And then the parcel, the subject parcel here, denoted in red. Again, about 2,100 acres. You see County Road 340 that runs directly through it. This is a 2-lane gravel improved and year-round maintained county road that provides very good access to our particular subject parcel. It's also referred to as Bear Creek Road because Bear Creek, which is a tributary to the Cacheras, runs right alongside of it and through our property. The property is well fed from a well here on section 12. And I mentioned those dikes earlier, but you see one that runs directly across our property. This forms kind of a ridgeline backbone upon which a 21,500 gallon water tank sits, and then gravity feeds pastures to both the north and south halves of the ranch, effectively bifurcating it, as well as a series of stock tanks, valve controlled stock tanks. There are 2 state, and everything in blue here is existing state-owned surface, state trust land surface. You see 2 sections that are in close proximity, this section 36 and this section 16. These are both a couple of subdivided parcels away from being connected. It's not as easy as buying a single connecting parcel, but there would be opportunities, especially here, to merge the use either through an easement corridor or a fee acquisition of one of the interline, one or two of the interline properties connecting the section 17 and 16 in the future.
I'm just curious, are the uses surrounding the ranch, including the pieces between the ranch and the existing state landward sections? Are all those uses similar, i.e. not residential subdivided, but more ag?
So the general model in this area and what's very prolific, almost all the way around this particular ranch, with the exception up to the northeast, which is a 5,300 acre ranch, are 40-acre subdivided ranchettes. Many of which have never been developed and there's no improvements on them, but they are already subdivided. As it's kind of been the model followed down. And for reference, the La Vida is kind of over here and the Spanish Peaks down.
And last question, just clearly, on the two state land board parcels in close proximity, are those being used for recreation or grazing or?
They are definitely both leased for grazing, I believe recreation as well, but Abe, please do jump on and correct me if that's not correct. Okay, so on the recreation piece, it's our assessment that due to its size, location, access, it's well positioned for leasing to a single medium-sized outfitter. There are multiple game species on the property: elk, deer, bear, mountain lion, and even small game, including turkey and upland bird. And staff believes that there's also potential for campground or lodge potential, either with or without additional improvements. I mentioned the well that's located here on the section 12. That's an electric fed well. There's a pole with electric already in place, and it's a fairly flat area that would provide for some easy configuration for camping purposes. On the other side of the creek in the section 7 are some areas that could potentially be used for camping if there were improvements, culvert and bridge improvements made to the creek crossing. That's not anticipated by staff at this time, but does provide some future optionality in the future.
For Commissioner Fro's benefit, it's not to say we would be limited to this, but we've had some success recently with some private companies that are building dispersed camping properties across the state. So camping could be anything from dispersed tent sites to something more intense, right?
Okay, and staff's recommendation formulation, we've determined that's likely the board will achieve an appropriate financial return. With these annual grazing leases, they would be tied very much to market and not set rates for 10-year periods. That may allow for some small increases in annual rents over time. As both the purchase price and appraised value were discussed with the board in executive session, but I'll note here in public session that the acquisition will occur at a discount to the appraised value. The property includes a 1969 water right for the Cucharas tributary along Bear Creek. And there is minimal initial stabilization capital required by the board. There are no working improvements. There's a shed and there are some old homestead sites, but nothing in terms of major current and usable improvements. That being said, as a part of this request, in addition to the NSE funds being requested for the purchase itself, staff is seeking board's authorization to expend up to $50,000 in investment and development funds for repairs and improvements that the Southwest District Manager deems necessary in the first 2 years of the board's ownership. Essentially as a preventative measure, but also to ensure that any of those small improvements can be made prior to our leasing of the property. And with that, I think I just hit my recommendation on the last slide, but it's two parts. It's the NSE authorization to acquire, and it's the IND authorization to expend the improvement and any remediation, is not the right word, and repositioning funds. Repositioning funds.
Are we doing that on one motion or?
Yes, and in fact, it's written as one in the board order. Are there any questions at this time?
Any questions from commissioners? It's physical property. Appreciate the work you put into
I think it's a cost more than 50,000 to remodel that.
it.
This is actually a very cool site. It was the former home site, I think in like the 1930s-ish, occupied by the family, all made out of mud. And it's fallen in to the point where the floor actually rests about where the sill sits on the building.
Nick, do we have, if there's no further comments from the board, Nick, do we have any public?
We don't have any public listening.
We have no one but us. Okay. That we will need a motion. And it's hopefully right there.
What order number on that again?
The reason there was no problem last time.
This Commissioner Thomas, I move we approve the replacement property acquisition, the Bear Creek Ranch as described in the board and as described in the board package, which includes the 50,000.
So that suffice.
Yes.
Fabulous.
Second,
We have a motion, Commissioner Chavez, second, Commissioner Clark. We will call a vote. Commissioner Clark.
aye.
Mr. Heath. Commissioner Chavez.
Yes.
Commissioner Crowe. And the chair votes yes. That motion passes 5-0, and I hope we can get something.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Nick, are you saying for this?
Commissioners, for the record, this is Assistant Director Nick Massey on behalf of Andy Bissett, Transactions and Records Services Manager, presenting the September board leasing agenda. As presented in your packet, you've got 7 leases to initiate as a result of competitive bid process and 1 new no surface occupancy lease. As part of that request, staff are available if there are questions on the agenda, on that leasing agenda. But otherwise, happy to entertain a motion if you're ready.
Questions from commissioners? All right, we'll need a motion.
This is Commissioner Clark. I move to approve the board leasing agenda for September 2022 as presented in our packet.
We have a second? Second. Motion, Commissioner Clark, second, Commissioner Crowe. Let's call a vote. Commissioner Clark,
Aye.
Commissioner Heath,
Aye.
Commissioner Shuster, Commissioner Crowe. And the chair votes yes, that motion passes 5-0. Thank you, Nick. Are there any questions or comments about the minutes as were presented in our package? All right, with that, we will pass them by acclamation. And I just want to thank everyone for, and Nick, again, the work that you put in to both the tour, the whole team, all the information you provided us, or Greg, was terrific and really important. So, and I especially appreciate the conversation. I think that was important to have, and I look forward to further discussion.
Before we adjourn, I just want to talk about upcoming meetings.
Yes.
Help set schedules.
Yes.
So as a reminder, we decided last month that the October meeting would occur on Tuesday, October 18th at noon. And Commissioner Clark, I think that you were traveling and that time worked for you to join us by phone. I have asked, I will not be present. And I've also asked staff to try and make that a light meeting, just business that we had to get done to take care of customers. So I anticipate it'll be an hour and a half or less. And it will be by Zoom. So nobody has to go anywhere. Right now, it'll be the oil and gas leasing agenda. There may be a couple other minor matters. For November, based on our discussion today, that meeting may have just gotten a little longer.
Yeah.
The dates for that are Wednesday, November 9th. We had originally set that up hoping it could be a single day meeting. Here's my plan for the day. In the morning, at your request, commissioners, I've put together a panel to talk to us about affordable housing. Both sort of framing the issue on a statewide basis. Somebody from the governor's office will speak a little bit about what the governor's priorities are and what some of the state tools are to deal with this. We'll have somebody from one of a smaller community who's speaking about how they're addressing housing in that community. George Thorne, who just opened the Capitol Square, is going to talk about the specific sources and uses of funds for that project. I think it's helpful to put finances to the reality of building one of those things. We will talk about parcels of land that we have that may or may not be available to help with this problem. And then we'll have a quick tour of the Capitol Square project. It's just a block from our offices. So that'll be the morning, we're 3 hours or so. And then in the afternoon, we've got a number of sort of reporting things that we need to get done in November. First, we, as fiduciaries, you all ought to know what our results for both revenues and expenses. Do we hit our budgets, that sort of stuff. So Nick will be presenting on that. Mindy will be providing the annual stewardship report. And for me, that's always a wonderful opportunity to see a year's worth of stewardship and all the tools we have for that distilled down into one report. But that's just as an important part of our mission as the financials. So we want to present those same time and give them equal footing. And then lastly, Greg will lead a discussion of our business units, how each of them did last year and what they're trying to accomplish for the coming year. And by doing that in Denver, each of those line of business unit leaders can be present for questions. So that combined report out is a couple of hours is scheduled right now. And then the REPI discussion. So I sense that we need probably another workshop before the vote. So we'll do that. Matt, I know you need, Matt LaFontaine, you need some time to sell one of the Boulder County parcels that we've been talking about for years going to their open space program.
Solid Minerals, I think, is bringing up.
There will be. So I think we can do this in one day, but it's going to be a long day, or we could split it into 2 days. It will be in Denver. So I'm deferring to you on what we're
I
going
would
to
just
add
say
to
that
that.
I think I'm thinking REPI piece by the time we do stewardship trust for an hour, probably. And REPI for at least an hour.
So this may need to spill into Thursday. We could stay overnight in Denver on Wednesday night and reconvene in the morning. Or we could send you all home on Wednesday night and do it by Zoom on Thursday morning and sort of stack the agenda so that the in-person things that required in-person people we did while we were all in the room together on Wednesday. So
Or vice versa, could we, or Wednesday, start Wednesday afternoon and finish on Thursday, anything within 2 days, but it's probably.
long story short, I think we've got 12 hours of content in
What's
November
our
and
December
an 8-hour
agenda
day.
right now?
So again,
Are we doing our fun lunch? Yes, okay.
we are, so I hope that you all join us in December in person as well. That's, we do a luncheon every year to honor our best lessees. Staff nominates folks who have been great partners to us in a number of categories, and they join us for the lunch and we give them awards to thank them for their partnership. But we do take care of business prior to that. Often it's been really light, but I suspect we'll need a rep and vote. Well, I don't know what your timeline quite looks like.
I'd like to not do that. I'd like to do November and January.
Okay.
And keep December late if we can, but it's up to you.
I would prefer that because that's going to have a lot of people and I think it's going to need more time.
Okay.
One thought crossed my mind, some of this end of your reporting we could do in December, a couple hour block.
I second that.
Because it's kind of, it's always a sort of positive and.
Yep.
I think.
Happy to push that and make
I'm
November one
assuming
day.
you keep November one day, if we just really do the staff report piece. in
Any of the
December.
three of you over there aware of any statutory or other considerations? This is a report out. It's not a blessing of legislative reports or anything like that.
I don't need a formal approval.
That that work
months.
for everyone?
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yes.
Okay.
I was on the refuge stuff, is there, as he puts together, or Greg's puts together the spreadsheets, can we look at those before the meeting? To at least start contemplating and.
Well, as always, we'll get our board packet out a week in advance. I don't know how much additional time he'll need to prepare the materials.
I'm sorry, were you asking about the rugby stuff?
Yeah.
Just have a spreadsheet of, before the meeting. I know we get the board package a week in advance.
I'm sitting here, I prefer not to promise you that you'll have it sooner, but we can try.
You're going to require a lot of input from the other people. in the room.
Yes, I get it.
It's hard to commit that.
All right. I think that's-
So maybe we just, by moving reporting to December, maybe just got the November to one day, which is
We'll have to do.
Wednesday, November
Matt's
9th.
vote. Yes.
Yeah.
Since we have some stuff we still have to do.
Yeah, it's still a long day. It's
Yeah, yeah,
affordable
I
housing in
gotcha.
the morning.
Okay. I think that's.
So we're not meeting on the tenth?
I think we just compressed the schedule enough to make it one day, albeit long day, so you can have the 10th back.
Okay.
Everybody okay with that? Anybody want to kick me before the commissioners start deleting?
Don't make any early dinner plans.
We'll not do that.
The night starts early, so there might need to be arrangements.
Some of you may want to come down.
Okay, I'm declining it. So there you go, Rachel. Okay, cool.
We are now with, if there's no further business, we're within 15 minutes of our originally projected time, which I think is pretty incredible.
What time did you say in October for Zoom?
Noon.
Noon.
And I hope that Rachel has sent you an invite.
It has been updated, but I'll double check. Make sure.
I have it. I did. All right. Fabulous. With that, we're adjourned.
Hold on, don't touch that. Thank you all.
All righty, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.